Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Nick Heap. We are meeting for the first time, and we've already discovered that we share some common values, which I think are very important in how we conduct ourselves in the world today. So, welcome, Nick, and tell us a little bit about who you are and maybe where you live and anything that you feel like may be of interest to us.
It's a big topic. Not the first two, but what's interesting. I'm who I am. As I said, I'm Nick Heap. I live in Hatfield, which is 20 miles north of London, London, UK. We've lived here for 50 years. I'm married. I've been married to Kay since 1966. So it's a good long stretch. We have two grown-up children. One is gay and she's a medic, and she and her wife live in Australia, in Mullumbimby, which is about 2 hours south of Brisbane, and my son and his wife live about 50 miles up the road from us, and we have two grown-up grandchildren. So that's a bit about me. Um,
So, so what if how have you spent your life? What, did you go, what'd you do after you finished your scholastic education when you were a child? Did you go off to college? What did you do?
yeah, I did. I was a very curious child. I wanted to find things out. And this led me eventually into science. So I did a first degree in chemistry, and a PhD in chemistry, organic chemistry, at the University of Birmingham. And then I met Kay at university. She was in her last year of a French degree at the same time as I was in my last year at my PhD. We got married, and 3 weeks later, we sailed on the last but one voyages of the Queen Mary. We went and lived in Chicago for 2 years, doing some more research and doing a lot of traveling, which was very interesting. We had to go on the Queen Mary because the only things we had were wedding presents, and if we'd shipped them by plane for the first 6 weeks, we wouldn't have anything. So it was definitely a bit of an adventure.
I bet it
Uh,
was.
yeah, we traveled. We bought a car after about 6 months, and we travelled 30,000 miles in 18 months around the US and Canada, and it was extraordinary.
What was the most surprising thing about that experience of traveling around the U.S.?
Um, well, it was the beauty of the national parks,
Mhm.
but also just how inaccessible the most of the countryside is. In Britain, everywhere is riddled with footpaths. But if you go and say, naively, well, let's go and drive to that lake and we can walk round it, you will find every house has got a fence which goes down to the lake line, and actually you can walk for about 100 yards around this state park or something, but you can't access any of the land. I mean,
Yeah.
it's very frustrating. Yeah, but we had some amazing times in the States, particularly the last 5 weeks. Just before we came home, we traveled around the national parks for 5 weeks. I still remember what it cost us in 1968. We had 5 weeks, 9,000 miles. Sorry, five 5,000 miles of traveling, something like that, or was it more? Might have been more. Um, and the whole trip cost us $160.
Now, things have changed a lot.
Yeah, that's right.
I used to live in Wyoming, right close to the two
Yeah,
national parks there, the Grand
yeah,
Tetons and Yellowstone. So I know what you mean by
yeah.
the inaccessibility. Um,
Mm,
I guess that's part of the charm, uh,
yes.
because to get there, you have to spend time. You have to make a commitment to get there, and in many respects, there is there's embedded in that experience what the first European settlers of the West experienced, which is long trips through
Mm,
beautiful
mm,
countryside, but not knowing where you are, because
yes.
it can tend to look like all the same. Um, and I think maybe the distinction is that you can do it by car and sleep in a motel and hire
Well,
hire a guide to take you on a hike or get
yeah.
on get on horseback and ride. So
Well,
it,
we camped and walked. We just drove between the parks. We didn't. But my something like my great aunt. I can't remember. I mean, how many greats? It's a long time back. We discovered. My father discovered many years ago that she was a Mormon. She went out with one of the second wave of Mormons to
uh-huh.
Salt Lake City, and she walked from Plymouth, Rhode Island, to Bancroft to Salt Lake City.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, through the sort of variety of weather you get in the US, baking hot summers and freezing winters. I mean, they obviously had a cart for their stuff, but actually they walked 2,000 miles.
Yes, that is exactly right. And we don't appreciate the suffering and the struggle that they went through to establish a new home.
Yes.
And that's part of the American story. And one of those that really fascinates me is the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was formed by Thomas Jefferson. And he sent this collection of military officers and soldiers west to discover how to go from St. Louis basically to the Pacific coast, and most of that area they had not been um, studied by white Europeans. It's all Indian country,
Yeah.
and so they had to. It's a great story in many respects. I don't need to go into the whole story, but today you can still follow most of the trail. And
Yeah.
my uh, my kids were younger, so we're talking now 20. This would be 22 years ago.
Mm.
Our family went out west,
Yeah.
and did a bunch of the. Uh, we went to a bunch of the Lewis and Clark locations,
Yeah.
but one of the fun things we did on that trip was we floated in a 18th century replica keelboat
Yeah.
down the Missouri River, camping at the sites where Lewis and Clark had camped. And
Mm.
the crew that took us on this journey were all dressed in period. I mean, they were all in character, and
Fun.
it was really remarkable. It's a great experience. So so what did you do with a PhD in chemistry?
I I did some research at the university. My boss, in fact, had had a brilliant student and done some outstanding piece of work about a year before I arrived. So he was coasting, and my project was not very well defined. So I didn't actually enjoy the research. But that was the time of the brain drain. It was very profitable for Europeans, Brits to go and work in the States because the salaries were so much higher than they were in the UK. But we were cheap labor as far as the UK was, as far as the US was concerned. Um, but PhD chemists were in considerable demand in the UK, so there were people going out and recruiting direct in the US. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, I ended up when I came back to the UK with Kay, and I got a job with ICI, which was a very well run, excellently well run chemical company, highly developmental of people. It would be the equivalent of working for, a really top flight company like Google or Tesla, or I don't know about Tesla, but certainly Google nowadays.
Hmm.
Um, but so I worked there. I was there doing basically science for the first year. But after a year, they had some consultants in the lab, and the consultants said, essentially, look, you've got all these really, bright young students in the lab, people who've done PhDs and sort of top BScs from top universities. But they're basically all individual prima donnas. They didn't use that word because if you're doing research, it's usually you and your supervisor and a problem. You don't actually have to deal with other people much. So it's all extremely left brain stuff. And so they said we need to do something about this. So they sent what they call the prime movers on some training which isn't fashionable now, which is called a T group.
Hmm.
T stands for training, but it's very unusual. It's not, yeah, because the task you have while you're in this group, for which you might be there for 5 days or something, but your task is to examine your own behavior as it happens.
Yes.
So, I mean, I learned a few things about myself, which is I used to talk very fast and I was very shy, so I didn't look at people, so I didn't notice whether they were listening to me or not, which I was able to correct. But towards the end of the workshop, I had a real flash of insight, which was we could solve all the problems we have in our industry if we just listened to each other. Because we have the skills and we have the knowledge, but what we're not doing is actually combining it, using it.
So,
Well,
what keeps us from listening to each other?
um, well, I think we haven't had enough experience of it. It's hard to experience. It's hard to do something that you haven't experienced enough. And unfortunately, most children don't get listened to very well, either by their parents or by teachers. There's a huge amount of adultism, which is basically the adults think they know everything and children don't know anything, and that their views don't count. So we haven't had an experience of being listened to, and it's really hard to give what you haven't experienced. I think that's one of the reasons. But this just to go back to this T group because this was really important for me, which was about a week after the T group, I had an even more powerful realization, which was I was always as though I heard I had a call which basically said, "Look, Nick, this issue about people not listening, this isn't an industry problem. This is the world problem. We can live in paradise. We can solve all the problems we have in the world if we just listen to each other. And by the way, and this was a kicker. By the way, it's your job. Fix it." Now that was a lot. That was 60 years. That was in 1970 that happened, which is a long time ago. So I'm 82 now, and I'm still working at it. I still haven't finished the job. So that led me to thinking, well, I need to change what I'm doing from doing science to doing something which is about helping people listen to each other. I didn't quite know what it was. I didn't want to leave the company because it was a good company. I didn't want to move house. I thought, so I'll see if I can find something in the company. Well, moving house wasn't an issue. I just certainly didn't want to leave the company. Can I find something in the company which enables me to do this? So it took me 4 years to persuade ICI that I was serious. And in the course of that, improving it, I had a year as a Samaritan listening to married couples who've been hating each other. Sorry, I got carried away with myself. A year as a Samaritan listening to potentially suicidal people. And then later that I moved into being a marriage guidance counselor, which is now called Relate, which was working with couples who might have been hating each other for a long time. But the training was wonderful. And I applied for jobs inside ICI and I didn't get them. And I'd say, why didn't I get the job? And or rather, what do I need to do to make it more likely to get one in future? And eventually I got a job inside ICI as an internal consultant, where my job for 6 years was essentially to do whatever I could get away with that was likely to be helpful. So I was listening to managers and I was helping them listen to their staff. And ICI was superb in the amount of training they gave me in things like process consultation and organization development and influencing skills and counseling and stuff like that. Um, and that was some amazing work, really, and really enjoyed it. And then I was made redundant because the bit of ICI I was working with was losing money and it was in the south of England and that site was closed. So all the long range jobs sort of fell out. And I started working for myself. And that's what I've been doing ever since. So it's a very brief, potted story.
Was it's fascinating because you
Yeah.
came out of the field of science,
Hmm.
presumably is a very left brain thing, and you found yourself working in something that's far more right brain, which is learning to teach our physical selves to listen,
Hmm.
and probably not listen to voices, but listen to the other kinds of signals that people put off. Am I right about that?
Yes. Well, I think listening isn't difficult if you decide to do it. The difficulty isn't doing it, it's deciding to do it. Um, because most people are so desperate to be listened to that that trumps everything. You can solve that problem very neatly by taking it in turns. So if you want to be listened to, yeah, and you meet Ed and you say, um, uh, Ed, have got anything on your mind? And I said, I'd love to listen to you for 15 minutes. Help, or just tell me what's on your mind. And then you'll say to Ed, well, how did you enjoy that? And the Eds of the world are going to say, that's wonderful. Because if you ever ask people, when was the last time you spoke to somebody for 20 minutes without them interrupting or changing the subjects? The usual answer is never. Um, and then you swap over. Then you say, oh, would you like to listen to me then for a bit?
It's Nick, this is very parallel to the way I operate. And my wrinkle to this is that I'm going to stop and talk to people that I don't know. And I'm going to talk to them about whatever it is they want to talk about.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I was in London last month. Was it last month? Yeah, it was last month. And time time is fleeting, passing. And I had on my first day had to go to the Apple store to get the right connectors. I had brought the wrong connectors for the UK. And I was walking back to my hotel. And this guy over here caught my eye. So I walked over to him, you know. And if someone looks at me, I'm going to go talk to them, regardless of who they are. And he was a man on the street interviewer,
Hmm.
had a young
Oh.
woman with her who was videotaping with a video, doing the video with her phone, and he had a Bluetooth wireless mic, and he wanted to know my thoughts about men's cologne. And I said, I've never worn it. And he says, well, if you took a woman out on a date, would you consider wearing it? I said, I don't know that. If she gave me the signal that she would like for me to smell better, yeah, I probably would. What ended up happening was after our little exchange was over, I said, get the video. Let me go talk to your partner here. So I went out and began to talk to her, and I was asking her the questions.
Yeah.
And and I thought she was like 27, 28 years old. She's only 20 years old. And it's we had a nice time, I actually, before I left them, I invited them to come on the podcast, but I haven't heard from them. But it's that kind of thing, which is if you're willing to go simply initiate something and then listen, people will tell you all kinds of things.
Yes. Yeah. A group, some about just before the COVID, a group of friends of mine met in a local cafe in a local park in the little town, which is about a few miles from us, because we decided to do something called random acts of listening.
Like
So with the first sort of time we met, we just talked about what we were about to do and about our feelings about it, anxieties and worries about it, and decided to go out and do it. And the task we'd set ourselves was that for an hour we would go out into the park or near the park, and we would engage perfect strangers in conversation. But our task was to understand their worlds from their point of view. But we agreed that we wouldn't introduce it by saying, do you have 10 minutes? Or this is a social experiment, or we're doing some research. We made it more difficult for ourselves. We said the connection has to be entirely natural. So you'd see somebody with a bouncy dog, for instance, and you say, gosh, that's a bouncy dog. And, it would be natural to say, the dog like coming to the park? And, and it would lead into a natural conversation. And the stories people told were extraordinary about when people had that space, they were talking about sad things and difficult things. And I met a guy from Israel who was with a young son, and he was talking about the difference between raising a son in Britain and in Israel, and it turned out to be largely the concern was the weather, because in Israel you could, kids be outside all the time, whereas in winter in the UK you're going to be inside. But he was an expert in psychoacoustics, which is how do you make a concert hall where people actually enjoy listening to the music. So it's not just about the physical acoustics, but it's about psychology of acoustics. And I met a guy waiting for a train who was going up to London to teach philosophy, but he turned out to be an expert in Vedic astrology, of all things. That's Indian astrology.
Right, right.
And we met afterwards. We had a cup of tea, we had a cup of coffee, and he was a very interesting guy, and he lives about 200 yards from me. So it was an absolute eye-opener to see all these resources and talents and different experiences which exist in a community. But it is not common for people deliberately to go out and try and make these connections. And the other thing that was interesting was, who are the people you easily approach and who are the people you avoid? For instance, I'm an old guy. I might avoid going to speak to young, pretty girls because they might think I've got some ulterior motive. Or I've found myself sometimes being put off by things like tattoos and ear piercings. Well, I met a young man on a train who was covered in tattoos and had don't think he had a piercing, but he certainly was had a shaven head and he looked very muscular, and you'd think this guy's aggressive and coarse and not very nice. And we ended up having a chat. He was a very gentle philosopher, actually.
Mhm.
So it's like the prejudices fall away. And wouldn't it be a wonderful world if people said, "Okay, I think it's about time I met a migrant, or
Yeah.
I met an asylum seeker, or I met somebody who's a different color from me, or comes from a different part of the world, and actually try to understand what they're like." You know, maybe even in your country, maybe I met somebody who was somebody who actually voted for a different political party from me. It's very likely they're human.
Yeah.
Most of them will be human.
So
This is radical stuff, really, but it's so flipping obvious that
what
we have.
ways, in what way is it radical? I mean, or maybe you're just being facetious, or you're making a joke, but it is rather radical because it's not done.
Well, it's radical because if you ever meet somebody and get to know somebody who is in a different group from you, you can never actually ever hang on to the prejudice, which is all people from this group are like this. You can't. Well, if you certainly met more than one, you can't. You can't hang on to the prejudice. It's not possible, particularly if it's a bad label. You can't hang on to it.
Yeah.
So it is radical in that sense.
Well, I think it also requires for us to have a sense of self-understanding where this vulnerability that we're expressing is not something that creates fragility for us. That it's okay for us to risk um, our introducing ourselves to someone who would seem to be totally um, unwarranted, let's say.
Hmm.
And I mean, I've recently I've initiated conversations with two young women because I'm really interested in them, and in both cases I began the conversation by asking them about their hair,
Hmm.
and I said I have no agenda here. I'm just curious about your hair. How do you do this? How do you make your hair look like it does? And in one, it's like this. It's like a floral arrangement of curls but it's also chaotic. I mean, it was beautiful. And then this other woman, her hair was a mixture of brown and golds and coppers and it was just exquisite. And I said, how do you make your hair look as beautiful as it is? And she says, I put oil on it. I said, really? I've never heard of that, you know? And so that asking in a sense, an ignorant but innocent question
Hmm.
puts us into a situation where that person becomes the authority
Hmm.
on their life. And
Hmm.
it's it never fails to be interesting in that regard.
Yeah, people are fascinating. I had this crazy thought, but wouldn't it be fascinating to meet the most boring person in the world? Because you'd have to say, hello, what happened to you? Because there's absolutely no chance that person was born boring. You've never met a boring baby.
They would
Something
probably say, well, I went into politics.
happened. Politicians are also human. I mean, I have a I put a very radical post out. This truly is a wacky radical idea called loving politicians, which is we pay politicians. But when you think, what is a politician asked to do? They're asked to handle anything on our behalf. That's what we let them to do, to handle anything on our behalf. Of course, they're human, and of course, some of them are damaged. But and when they do that, they're going to have everything they do scrutinized. Everything is going to be criticized. Everybody is going to be trying to pull their strings. And and they get absolutely nothing. Never do they get much. Sorry, they get very, very rarely do they ever get anybody phoning them up and saying, "Look, I know you. Or sending a letter and saying, "Look, it must be flipping tough doing what you're doing. Is there any way I can help?"
Yeah.
Nobody does. Nobody does that.
No.
And
It,
it's not surprising they get incredibly defensive because they're getting attacked all the time. Defensive aggressive, because that's what you do, wouldn't you? If you get attacked all the time.
well, I think they also find themselves in very compromising situations because they haven't listened. And they're
Hmm.
not listening to the wise people in their parties.
Yeah.
They 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 see opportunities. I mean, I think your whole thing about listening would be something that the political party should grasp hold of and teach their people how to do. Because I think, at least here in the U.S., it's we just finished a presidential election, and it's remarkable how deep and wide is the divide between the two parties. And I think a lot of it is because they haven't been listening to people, and
No.
they haven't been listening to the voters. And when the voters get a chance to vote, that it becomes a very great surprise. Oh, really? And if they're willing to even listen to the implications of the vote. So
Yeah.
I think let me take this to a larger environment. I mean, you worked in a large company, corporate
Hmm.
company, and you learned how to do this in that company, but you learned because you chose to learn. You had that initiative to go out and learn to do this and find a way to make it fit into the structure of the organization. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
Um, so where does this idea of listening fit into the? I mean that was in the 1970s when you did that.
Yeah.
Um, it's a very much different time. So what do you think about today and how organizations find themselves in a situation where they should be listening to people and customers? And you have any thoughts on where we are today in that regard?
Um, well, I don't think things have, the need for it is just the same as it always was, really. I mean, if you have a product or service, um, you need to build strong relationships with customers. You need to understand what customers need before you can provide anything, or while you provide something rather. And so, therefore, listening to your customers is obviously vital. Good relationships with your customers are obviously vital. I mean, internally, an organization only has any more power than a collection of individuals because of the connections that people have within it, because of the relationships that people have within it. So fostering internal communications in an organization is vital. And there are lots of very simple things that people can do to improve communications in organizations, which are really quite well known by people in the field, but still aren't practiced. I don't know, Ed, whether you go to meetings at all. Do you go to meetings?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Most meetings are pretty bad.
Yeah. I agree.
And there's a very simple thing you can do to make them ever so much better. So you go to a meeting and you have a topic the meeting needs to decide on, like how can we improve the service to our customers, or um, we need a new product, or um, we need to influence the some local organization to do something different. It doesn't matter what, it doesn't actually matter what the topic is.
Right.
And typically what will happen is somebody will raise this, and usually the boss will say what the boss thinks, and then ask anybody if they've got any ideas. And people will agree with the boss, and the noisy people will talk a lot, and the quiet people who think won't say anything. And everybody will feel somewhat miffed at the end of it. But you can change that completely by doing a very simple tool, which is a thing called a go round, which I call a go round anyway, which is where you say to people, okay, we've got this issue. I'd like to hear from everybody your very best thinking about this topic, what we might do about it. You've got 2 minutes each. Now, the real trick is to go around the group in the reverse order of seniority,
Yeah.
because the young and the junior will have fresh ideas because they've not been conditioned, and they can't agree with the boss because they haven't heard what the boss says yet. So you go around in the reverse order of seniority. People talk. They have a limited amount of time, and you police it. So the quiet people have time to think and put their views carefully because they're not going to be interrupted. And the noisy people have to condense their thinking and distill the very best bits out so they think better too. And as a result of that, you get ideas from everyone.
Right.
And the boss goes last, because then the boss has a chance to hear from everybody. Now, that's an incredibly simple thing to do, which isn't widely.
Validates what I have seen. Um, Validated what I saw as a consultant and validated what I saw as an employee,
Yeah.
which is that there's this um, gap, separation between the
Mm.
executive managerial level and the
Yeah.
worker.
Yeah. Yeah.
And all the material that is developed is for the managerial level.
Yeah.
And so there's this kind of bubble that they all live in, where, the business schools and the schools of psychology and sociology and whatever are all speaking to this group of people,
Mm.
not writing for the lower echelon of the company. And what I found was, as a consultant, I would talk to everybody,
Mm.
and
Mm.
I came to see that this is a long statement, but it's a statement that I use a lot. If there's a persistent residual culture of values that persists because it resides in the relationships of the people.
Mm. Yeah.
And you talk to someone who's been with a company for 10, 15 years, and one of the things you're going to hear is why they love the company.
Mm.
And while the public may hate the company, these
Mm.
people love the company, and they love it for all the right reasons, which is this company's doing good work. It could do better work if the managerial class got out of its way.
Sometimes that's
There's a
true.
division there, but there's a division there, which doesn't mean that one is right or wrong. It just means that they need to listen to one another and collaborate with one another so that they can figure out how to work together for the betterment of the company.
Mm. And again, there are simple tools. Team building is often seen as something that people do in work groups, and sometimes and But you can also do team building very effectively with pairs. So, for instance, suppose that you have uh, a manager and a um, somebody who works for that person, or maybe you have a customer and somebody who supplies the customer. Really, any pair of people in an organization, and you do a very simple thing, which is each of you sits down with a piece of paper or the electronic equivalent, and you write down things I could do to help you, to things you could do to help me. Now, each of you sit down with those pieces of paper, and then you share them.
Yeah.
And you will find there are things that you can do to help me, which cost you nothing, which really make my life easier. And there are things I can do to you, which cost nothing, which would really make you, and you didn't know them beforehand. There may be some things you can bargain in, and there may be some things that can't be done because they take too long or they're politically impossible. But either way, you'll make substantial improvements in the way in which you cooperate.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly
Another
right.
area which I'm very interested in is appreciative inquiry. I don't know if you're familiar with that, Ed.
I am.
I think appreciative inquiry is extremely powerful because it's a positive approach and it says in any situation something's working. So find out what's working and see how you can have more of it. It's much more fun. It's much more interesting. It's much more engaging, and it's much less effort than grinding away at problems. And even if things are dire and people need to tell you how awful they are, at the end, when you really listen well and they're starting to feel a bit better because somebody's heard them, you can say, "Gosh, how on earth have you survived that? What strengths have you used to survive that awful situation?" Then people feel good. And when people feel good, they're ready to think how things can be better. But if you're feeling dreadful, it's demoralizing, it's depressing, and you find it very hard to think of even the possibility that things could be better. And there is a link to this in the global situation that we're in, which is we are bombarded through the media with news about what is not working. Media is overwhelmingly skewed to bad news because of I don't know, it's a myth, but it's certainly held idea that bad news sells newspapers or the equivalent, that people are really only interested in bad news. I really think that needs challenging. Look, we've got yes, there are at least two or three, maybe more, really nasty wars going on at the moment. But there's far more countries living in peace with each other than there are wars. Why don't we hear about those? Why don't we hear about country X cooperating brilliantly with country Y?
Well, my latent cynicism would say it is because when you raise the flag of distress, you are saying, I am going to be the one who can fix this. Of course, they're
Hmm.
not also saying I have been responsible for creating this crisis, which, if they've been in power for any length of time, all the crises are in their hands, and they're responsible. Of course, they never want us to believe that they're responsible for creating it, but
Well,
and
what do they say? Look, we've actually helped these two countries that were falling out not fall out anymore. I mean, they must have good stories to tell, but we never hear them. There's a
well,
you should look at a book called Factfulness, Ed.
yes,
You know it?
I know the book. It's a great
Yeah,
book.
yeah. But that shows that things like we get lots of information about things being terrible all the time because it's dramatic. And small improvements don't get much in the way of recognition or news.
I have a couple more questions for you, and
Okay, go
one
ahead, shoot.
one of them has to do with the fact that you're 82, and I'm curious as to um, what it is that you feel. Um, how do I want to ask this question? I want
Permanent.
to know what your thoughts are on being able to work up into your 80s. That you have not stopped, you have not chosen the traditional retirement at 65 or 70, but you have continued on. And I'm curious as to what is it that has motivated you to do that?
Well, it's part because of what happened to me in 1970, which is the job I have to do, which isn't finished. Um, I've done some work to discover my personal purpose as well through a process called core process, and my personal purpose is creating awareness, and I can do that. I can do that out of work, of course, but actually, why shouldn't I do what I love doing and get paid occasionally for it as well? It seems logical to me. And I like being having the opportunity to do things I've never done before. I enjoy I enjoy the challenge. I'd be I can't imagine enjoying spending 20 years. I mean, we've gone on holiday an awful lot, my wife and I. People in the States would be amazed every time, ever since I started working for myself, we were away for 10 weeks a year. But I couldn't imagine being on holiday all the time. I
Yeah.
like making a difference.
Yeah. Well, that's
It's
the difference that you're making as
yes.
as someone who has chosen a different
Yeah.
path. And so work for you was not a thing that you did, but it was actually your calling and your
Yes, it doesn't feel like work. I mean, that's the advantage when you're lined up. I mean, what you do is lined up with what you're here for. Then work isn't work anymore. It really isn't.
I
Because I do this whether I do what I do whether I was paid for it or not. You know,
I'm very much like you,
Mm.
and I'm 71,
Yeah,
and
looking young.
I'm planning to work at least to 100.
Good.
My plan is to publish my last book on my 100th birthday.
Well, that's a nice goal. Well,
Well,
it's slightly unambitious. I mean, one of your last books, I think, because you might do one on 101. Why give up
I might. Well, but I don't see it as ambitious. I
Yeah.
see it as like you do, which is this is how my purpose affects me on a daily basis. I'm going to continue to work on this, and um, when I published this book,
Mm.
see if I can,
Yeah, you can.
in 2018,
Yeah.
and in the book, my purpose is to help people take personal initiative to create impact in their local communities.
Mm.
And that's my purpose. And that's what I'm doing. And then I was asked by someone, so what is your goal? So we get kind of it gets a little more complicated if we're talking about goal and mission and purpose and I thought about that and I said my goal is to see 1% of the world's population take personal initiative to create impact in their local communities, which is not unlike what your sense of mission is.
Yeah.
I mean, they are very parallel to one another. And and then I was asked, when I say there's 1% of 1% of what is now 8 billion people, I think, which is like 80 million people, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not a numbers guy, but I think it's 80 million people. So I was asked, so how are you going to do that?
Yeah.
And I said, I'm not. But the people are going to do that because they're going to, it's one person's going to inspire another person who's going to inspire another person.
Yeah. Sure. Sure. Yeah, good infection.
If that's really happening. And it's interesting because this podcast that I'm doing, the Eddie Network podcast, is a vehicle for that.
Yes. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we were introduced by Dennis Spotoko, right?
Yes, he's a good guy.
Okay. Dennis and his wife are having a huge impact around the world. Now,
Hmm.
he's connected you and I together. He's connected me with some other people. Um, and now I know your story and you know my story. And what I'm asking of you as my guest is that you will introduce me to people that you think should be on my podcast, and then I will get to meet some more people. And so I'm looking at doing this thing for a very long time because the 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 numbers speak to a huge network of people at a global scale, but all those people are operating very much in a local context.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you know people who would like to be clearer about their purpose, and you can get this is a process which only takes an hour, and you get two words that you remember forever, or at least for a very long time. It's called core process. It's a story-based thing. You
Yeah,
tell a story about a time when life was amazing, and then you work with some words to discover what it is that you were doing, and then you'll find it fits what you're doing when you're really enjoying yourself and making a difference. So my two words are creating awareness. So I loving doing things like this where I've no idea what I'm doing, and where I can help people see things they might not have seen before, and also when my own awareness gets stretched, which is why one of the reasons why Kay and I have enjoyed foreign travel so much. So we've traveled off the beaten track in 50 countries now, including having been to India 5 times.
that's one.
Um, and so, it is fascinating to see how other people live and also the commonalities they have. Um, and, ask you real, when you experience those different cultures, you see things you don't see about your own. Like Nepal is one of the poorest countries in the world materially. I've never, ever, anywhere seen such happy people as I did in Nepal.
I
So
understand.
they're materially poor and spiritually rich. Um, we were there for 3 weeks. We only heard a child cry on 3 occasions because they're carried on their mums' backs until they don't want to be carried anymore,
Hmm.
and they're allowed to run around free, and nobody worries about them getting dirty because they probably only have a couple of things to wear anyway.
Yeah.
Um, and Clearly, they're parented by the village, not by the individual, not just by the parents. So they feel very safe. We've got a lot to learn from people that we think are less than us in the West. You come across the continuum
That
con.
is that where you find hope?
Um, well, I find hope from from a very personal experience, which I didn't mention to you, which is when I was about 8, I had this extraordinary thing which I can't explain, where I saw the far future, and you'd be relieved to know that we make it. I saw people being happy, dancing, looking after each other, and looking after the planet, and scratching their heads and saying, "I wonder why we got so confused for so long." Because we live in paradise.
Yeah.
If you stand back from and look at the Earth from space, you can see and think about it. We have blue oceans. We have incredible creatures if you didn't know a hippopotamus existed, you'd never be able to imagine one, ever. We have it's a wonderful place to explore. It's very complex. We have people who are very different, see the world in different ways. We have a rich variety of cultures, thousands of languages, words which exist in one language which don't exist in another. And the only reason we get in such a mess is because we can't think when we're hurting.
Yeah.
When you talk to somebody who's listening to you, you actually express some of the painful emotion, and you can then recover your ability to think. and you can go on doing that without limit, which is why taking turns listening to each other is such a crucial process for us to get out of the mess that we're in. And anybody can do it. It doesn't cost anything.
That's true. Well, Nick, I appreciate you very much, and I like all that you say, and I totally agree with you. And find that what you say is exhibited in a lot of things that I do, and there's a lot more stories we could tell about organizational situations where listening would have been a better choice than something else.
Yeah.
I wish you well as you continue to do this work, and I hope that you don't finish before you breathe your last breath, so that you have something that carries you through the finish line.
Thank you very much for listening to me. I've enjoyed it. I mean, I had no idea what we were going to end up talking about. So,
I didn't either.
yes, thank you. It's a nice piece of work you're doing. Do you have any idea when something might appear? Because I've no idea on timescales.
Um, yes, it'll appear probably in early January.
Right. I'm sure you'll send me a link when it comes
Yeah, oh
out.
yeah, yeah. If you would send me just whatever you would like to put in the show notes, I'll be glad to do that. And I thank you for being here, and I thank you all of you who are watching. Please subscribe and hit the like button and leave a comment if you would, because
Yeah. Yeah. So is this actually going to go out filmed then, or merely as a podcast?
it'll be filmed. It'll be a
Right.
film.
I hadn't realized that. I would have worn a smart jumper.
No, you're perfect. No,
You're so nice.
we don't want people prettying themselves up, you know. Uh,
Thank you very much, Ed. Okay.
thank you,
Righto.
thank you all, and we'll see you next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye bye.
Thanks, Eddie.